By the end of this decade, artificial intelligence data centers alone could consume close to 1 trillion kilowatt hours of electricity every year. That is more power than many advanced industrial economies use in total. In Ireland, data centers already account for around 1/5 of all metered electricity, quietly forcing grid operators to consider how power is allocated when supply tightens. This is not a story about software, algorithms, or digital intelligence. It is a story about wires, substations, gas turbines, and household electricity bills. How did something invisible begin competing with homes, hospitals, and factories for electricity? And when pressure builds inside the grid, who ultimately pays the price? To answer that question, the story must first step back and understand what artificial intelligence data centers actually are and why electricity behaves unlike any other resource in the modern economy. To understand why artificial intelligence data centers are straining power systems, the story must strip away abstract language and return to physical reality. A modern artificial intelligence data center is not simply a warehouse filled with computers. It is a dense industrial facility designed to operate at extremely high utilization, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Unlike offices or factories, its electricity demand does not follow human schedules. It does not slow down at night or pause on weekends. Training large artificial intelligence models requires thousands of specialized processors running simultaneously for extended periods. These machines generate intense heat, which must be removed continuously through energy-intensive cooling systems. Once training ends, electricity demand does not fall away. Inference workloads replace it, turning these facilities into permanent, high-intensity electricity consumers. This matters because electricity behaves differently from almost every other economic input. Oil can be stored, coal can be stockpiled, natural gas can be compressed and shipped, money can be borrowed, delayed, or printed. Electricity must be produced and consumed at the same moment. If supply and demand fall out of balance, even briefly, the system fails. Blackouts are not financial events. They are physical consequences. Because of this, power grids are built around a critical concept known as reserve margin. At any moment, the system must have spare capacity available to absorb unexpected demand spikes or equipment failures. For decades, grid planners assumed demand growth would be slow and predictable. Digitalization, electrification, and population growth were expected to unfold gradually. Traditional data centers for email, cloud storage, and streaming fit within that model. Artificial intelligence does not. What makes artificial intelligence data centers different is not only their size, but their speed. Large technology companies can plan and build new facilities in months. Power grids move on timelines measured in years. Transmission lines require permits, environmental reviews, land access, and political approval. Substations depend on large transformers that are already in short supply globally. The system was never designed for demand that could appear faster than infrastructure can respond. This mismatch creates a growing bottleneck known as the grid connection queue. Across multiple countries, large new electricity users are waiting years for physical capacity to connect safely to the grid. When capacity does become available, it often arrives through temporary measures, such as increased reliance on dispatchable generation or emergency system adjustments. These steps preserve reliability in the short term, but they raise costs and complicate long-term planning. For households and small businesses, none of this is visible. Electricity still flows when the switch is flipped. Bills arrive weeks later, detached from the forces shaping them. But beneath that surface, the system is being quietly reshaped by a new category of demand, large enough to alter regional energy balances. And that leads to the central question that pushes the story forward. If artificial intelligence demand is arriving faster than grids can adapt, where does the pressure go next? And what breaks first when physical limits are reached? For most of the past 3 decades, digital growth followed a reassuring pattern. Computing power increased, yet electricity use remained relatively contained. Servers became more efficient. Each generation of hardware delivered more performance per unit of energy. Grid planners absorbed this lesson and quietly built it into their long-term assumptions. Artificial intelligence breaks that pattern. Modern artificial intelligence systems do not scale like traditional software. Training a large model requires running tens of thousands of specialized processors in parallel, often for weeks at a time. These processors are designed to maximize throughput, not energy efficiency. While efficiency per calculation improves, the total volume of computation expands even faster. Once training ends, electricity demand does not disappear. Continuous inference takes over, keeping facilities operating at high load around the clock. What makes this demand shock particularly destabilizing is how quickly it arrived. Until recently, most long-range energy forecasts assumed that electricity demand in advanced economies would grow slowly. In some regions, it was expected to remain nearly flat. Data centers were included in these projections, but only as a manageable component. Artificial intelligence workloads were either absent from forecasts or treated as marginal. That assumption unraveled in a very short time. Within a few years, large technology companies began announcing new artificial intelligence-focused facilities at a scale that materially changed regional demand outlooks. In several electricity markets, projected data center consumption is now large enough to alter grid planning assumptions that were made only a few years earlier. These shifts are not speculative. They are backed by capital commitments, land acquisition, and long-term contracts. The deeper problem is not the absolute size of artificial intelligence demand. It is the mismatch between expectation and reality. Power systems are built using forecasts. When forecasts underestimate growth, reserve margins shrink. When reserve margins shrink, grid operators become cautious. They delay the retirement of older power plants. They rely more heavily on dispatchable generation to protect reliability. They operate systems closer to their technical limits. Each response stabilizes the grid in the short term. Each also carries a cost. Electricity prices become more sensitive to stress. Maintenance schedules tighten. Tolerance for unexpected outages decreases. In some cases, regulators slow or pause new connections, not because electricity is unnecessary, but because the system cannot absorb additional load without risk. From the outside, none of this appears dramatic. Lights remain on. Innovation headlines continue. Artificial intelligence services expand across daily life. But beneath that surface, planning models are being rewritten under pressure. This is why the artificial intelligence electricity surge feels sudden even to experts. It was not the result of a single policy decision or public debate. It emerged from thousands of private investment choices that individually made sense, but collectively reshaped national energy trajectories. The demand shock was not planned because no single institution was responsible for planning it. Energy ministries forecasted gradual change. Grid operators prepared for linear growth. Technology firms optimized for speed and scale. When systems like this fall out of alignment, pressure does not disappear. It moves. The next chapter follows that pressure downstream into the physical constraints of the grid itself, where wires, substations, and connection queues determine who can connect, who must wait, and how long the system can hold before strain becomes unavoidable. Electricity demand can surge in months. Power grids cannot. This imbalance sits at the center of the artificial intelligence data center problem, while large technology firms can secure land, financing, and equipment at extraordinary speed. The grid they depend on is constrained by physics, regulation, and time. Transmission lines take years to permit and build. Substations rely on specialized transformers that often face long global backlogs. Distribution networks were designed to serve households, offices, and traditional industry, not clusters of continuous industrial scale demand appearing almost overnight. The grid is not elastic. When a large artificial intelligence data center seeks to connect, it does not simply draw power from the nearest line. It must be integrated into a system that balances supply and demand continuously across an entire region. That integration depends on spare capacity in transmission corridors, substations, and local distribution equipment. In many places, that spare capacity has already been exhausted. This is where the bottleneck becomes visible. Across multiple electricity systems, grid operators have introduced connection queues for large new users. These queues are not bureaucratic delays. They are physical waiting lists for infrastructure that has not yet been built. In some long-established European grid hubs, connecting a new data center can take 7 to 10 years, and in extreme cases, even longer. The system is effectively signaling that demand has arrived faster than it can be absorbed safely. Ireland provides one of the clearest illustrations. As data centers expanded, electricity demand rose far more rapidly than grid reinforcement. Reserve margins narrowed. Grid operators issued explicit warnings about security of supply, particularly during peak periods. Temporary measures were discussed not as long-term energy strategy, but as safeguards against instability. Similar dynamics are emerging elsewhere. In parts of the United States where data center development is concentrated, grid operators have warned that transmission congestion and tightening reserve margins are increasing reliability risks. Local substations become choke points. Each new connection adds stress unless matched by new infrastructure. When infrastructure cannot be built fast enough, systems adapt in less visible ways. One adaptation is delay. Grid operators slow or ration new connections, effectively determining which projects proceed first based on queue position rather than public debate. Another is reliance on dispatchable generation. Power plants designed for occasional use are called upon more frequently to stabilize the system. Backup generation is used to manage peak risk. These measures keep electricity flowing, but they raise operating costs and complicate emissions planning. A third adaptation involves cost distribution. Upgrading grids is capital-intensive. Transmission lines, substations, and system reinforcement require large, sustained investment. While large users typically pay connection charges, much of the long-term cost is recovered through regulated network tariffs. These tariffs are paid by all electricity customers, spreading the cost of grid expansion across households and small businesses. This is the quiet tension created by the grid bottleneck. The benefits of artificial intelligence computing are global. The infrastructure costs are local. The grid becomes the place where private acceleration meets public obligation. None of this implies deliberate intent. Grid operators act to preserve reliability. Technology firms act to compete and scale. The conflict arises because the system linking them was designed for a slower, more predictable world. As capacity tightens, the grid's role changes. It stops being a neutral delivery system and becomes a gatekeeper. Decisions about who connects, who waits, and who bears rising costs move from technical engineering into economic and political territory. And that shift leads to the next question. When the grid absorbs pressure on behalf of the economy, who ultimately carries the burden once the bottleneck tightens further? When electricity systems come under strain, the costs do not appear with labels. There is no line on a household bill that says artificial intelligence. Instead, the burden moves quietly through tariffs, network charges, and public budgets dispersed across millions of people who never agreed to the trade. This is how the cost of the artificial intelligence electricity shock is transferred. Large data center operators sit at the center of the system. They sign long-term power purchase agreements, secure favorable rates, and in some cases invest directly in generation assets. On paper, this suggests they are paying for their electricity needs. In reality, these arrangements cover only the cost of producing power. They do not fully account for the infrastructure required to deliver it reliably at scale. Electricity systems are layered. Generation is only the first layer. Transmission lines, substations, redundancy, and system balancing make up the rest. These layers are regulated monopolies, financed not by global technology firms, but by local ratepayers and taxpayers. When grids must be reinforced to accommodate large new loads, regulators face a familiar dilemma: assign the full cost to the new users, and projects slow or move elsewhere. Socialize the cost, and infrastructure is built more quickly, but households and small businesses absorb the bill. Most systems choose a compromise that leans towards socialization because reliability is politically non-negotiable. The result is a gradual rise in electricity costs that feels disconnected from cause. For households, this appears as higher network charges rather than higher energy prices. Even when wholesale electricity prices fall, regulated grid fees can continue rising to pay for expansion and reinforcement. Electricity becomes more expensive not because power is scarce, but because the system delivering it is under increasing stress. Small and medium-sized businesses face even sharper pressure. Unlike large technology firms, they cannot negotiate bespoke contracts or hedge costs globally. Electricity becomes a fixed expense that erodes margins in manufacturing, food processing, retail, and local services. In some regions, this accelerates closures or relocation decisions long before any outage occurs. There is also a public finance dimension. When grid upgrades become urgent, governments intervene. Public funds are used to speed up permitting, subsidize infrastructure, or secure emergency capacity. These expenditures are financed through taxes or borrowing, spreading the cost of artificial intelligence-driven grid expansion across society as a whole. This is where the political economy becomes difficult to ignore. The benefits of artificial intelligence are diffuse and often global. The costs of grid reinforcement are local and immediate. A household facing higher electricity bills does not see a direct return from a data center serving international cloud demand. The connection between benefit and burden becomes opaque. Opacity matters because it suppresses debate. Rising electricity costs are often attributed to climate policy, fuel markets, or geopolitics. Artificial intelligence rarely appears in the explanation, even when it is a material contributor to local demand growth. Without visibility, there is no informed discussion about whether costs are being allocated fairly. And yet, allocation is a choice. Regulators could require large new electricity users to fund a greater share of grid upgrades. Governments could redesign tariffs to reflect peak system stress rather than average consumption. Utilities could impose stronger obligations for demand flexibility. Each option redistributes costs and incentives, and each faces resistance from powerful stakeholders. For now, the default outcome is quiet diffusion. Costs spread thinly across millions of bills, rarely enough to trigger immediate backlash, but sufficient to reshape household budgets over time. Electricity becomes another pressure point in a cost of living environment already strained by housing, healthcare, and food prices. This chapter reveals a simple reality. When infrastructure is stressed by rapid private expansion, someone pays. The question is not whether costs exist, but whether they are visible, deliberate, and equitable. That question grows more urgent when electricity policy collides with another public commitment governments have made repeatedly: climate action. For more than a decade, energy policy in advanced economies has rested on two public promises. Electricity would become cleaner and it would remain reliable. The rapid expansion of artificial intelligence data centers is now forcing governments to confront how fragile that balance truly is. In theory, artificial intelligence facilities can be powered by renewable energy. In practice, electricity systems operate under physical constraints. Wind and solar generation are variable. They produce electricity when weather conditions allow, not necessarily when demand peaks. Artificial intelligence data centers, by contrast, require continuous and uninterrupted power. Even short interruptions that might be tolerable for households can be unacceptable for facilities supporting critical digital infrastructure. This mismatch pushes energy systems toward dispatchable generation, sources that can be turned on when needed. In many regions, that means natural gas. In others, it means delaying the retirement of coal-fired power plants or relying more heavily on existing thermal capacity. These decisions are rarely framed as reversals of climate policy. They are framed as reliability measures. But the effect is the same. Emissions decline more slowly than planned because grid operators cannot risk instability. This is where artificial intelligence quietly reshapes climate politics. Governments that committed to ambitious decarbonization targets now face an uncomfortable trade-off. Slowing artificial intelligence expansion risks lost investment, reduced competitiveness, and strategic vulnerability. Accelerating grid and generation build-out without regard to emissions undermines climate credibility. Attempting to do both simultaneously increases cost and complexity. Energy security further intensifies the dilemma. Electricity is not only an environmental concern, it is a strategic asset. Grids must withstand extreme weather, cyber threats, and supply disruptions. Large, concentrated data center loads raise the stakes. Systems operating with narrow reserve margins become more vulnerable to shocks, whether from heat waves, cold snaps, or equipment failure. As a result, governments prioritize resilience. Fuel supply is secured, backup capacity is retained. Power plants scheduled for closure remain online longer than planned. These choices are defensive, not ideological. But they shift energy mixes in ways that are difficult to reverse quickly. In countries dependent on imported fuels, the tension becomes sharper. Artificial intelligence demand increases the need for stable electricity supply, while geopolitical risk complicates energy procurement. Reliability rises to the top of the policy hierarchy, often above emissions targets in moments of stress. The outcome is a series of quiet compromises. Climate goals are not abandoned. They are delayed, adjusted, or reinterpreted. Timelines stretch. Exceptions multiply. Policymakers avoid acknowledging that the energy transition was designed around demand assumptions that no longer hold. For citizens, the consequences are indirect but tangible. Electricity systems become more expensive to operate. Household bills rise. Trust in climate policy weakens when people are asked to pay more while fossil fuel use persists. Political narratives harden, framing climate ambition and economic security as opposing forces. None of this suggests that artificial intelligence is inherently incompatible with decarbonization. Over the long term, cleaner firm generation, storage, efficiency gains, and demand management could realign the system. But the transition period matters. Right now, that transition is being shaped under pressure rather than design. This chapter exposes the deeper cost of the artificial intelligence electricity surge. It is not only financial, it is strategic. Governments are being forced to decide which promises to keep first and which to postpone. That brings the story to a broader view. If these pressures are already visible in a handful of regions, what happens when they scale globally, and how do different systems absorb the shock in very different ways? The pressure created by artificial intelligence data centers is global, but its consequences are uneven. Energy systems differ in scale, flexibility, regulation, and legacy design. As a result, the same demand shock produces very different outcomes depending on where it lands. The United States illustrates one end of the spectrum. The country benefits from size and resource diversity. It has multiple large regional grids, access to domestic fuel, and significant generation capacity. This creates the appearance of resilience. Yet that resilience is unevenly distributed. In regions with heavy data center concentration, electricity demand is rising far faster than grid infrastructure was designed to accommodate. The issue is not national scarcity, it is local congestion. In several regions, artificial intelligence-driven demand is stressing transmission corridors and substations that were built decades ago. These networks were designed to move power from centralized plants to dispersed users, not to serve clusters of continuous industrial-scale load. Upgrading them requires approvals across multiple jurisdictions, a process that often moves slower than private investment cycles. The result is a system that looks stable until it is suddenly strained. Emergency measures preserve reliability, but regional electricity costs begin to diverge. Areas hosting large data center clusters face higher prices and tighter capacity, even while national averages appear manageable. Inequality emerges inside a single country, driven not by income or productivity, but by grid geography. Europe presents a different configuration. European electricity systems are denser, more interconnected, and more tightly regulated. This structure offers stability, but it limits flexibility. Many countries operate with constrained domestic energy resources and strong commitments to decarbonization. When artificial intelligence demand accelerates, it does so inside systems already balancing electric vehicles, heat pumps, renewable integration, and industrial electrification. Ireland represents an extreme case. Success in attracting data centers collided with a small, relatively isolated grid. As data center electricity consumption grew rapidly, the impact became impossible to conceal. Grid operators issued explicit warnings about system adequacy. Connection rules tightened. New projects faced restrictions that larger systems could delay. This forced an early political reckoning. Policymakers had to confront questions others could postpone. Should economic growth be limited by energy capacity? Should foreign-owned digital infrastructure receive priority over domestic demand? And how much risk is acceptable in pursuit of competitiveness? Other European countries face similar pressures on a slower timeline. In Germany and the Netherlands, grid congestion is already delaying electrification of industry. Artificial intelligence demand enters systems already under stress. Each additional load sharpens the trade-offs between climate goals, affordability, and reliability. Smaller and energy-constrained economies experience the shock most intensely. Countries with limited grid capacity, high import dependence, or few interconnections have little room to absorb sudden large loads. Artificial intelligence demand can crowd out other uses or force rapid and costly upgrades. In these contexts, data centers feel less like neutral investment and more like external extraction of local infrastructure capacity. Over time, this produces a structural pattern. Artificial intelligence capacity concentrates where energy systems can tolerate it. Regions with abundant fuel, flexible regulation, and spare grid capacity attract investment. Others fall behind, not because of lack of talent or ambition, but because of physical constraints. A new geography of digital power begins to form, shaped by electricity rather than software. The consequences extend beyond energy. Housing markets near data center clusters tighten as construction and technical activity increases. Local governments face pressure to expand services. Land values rise. Communities that see few direct benefits begin to question the trade. Political opposition grows, not against technology itself, but against the way its costs are distributed. At the national level, these tensions feed broader debates about dependence and resilience. If critical digital infrastructure clusters in a handful of energy-advantaged regions, others become reliant on them for computing capacity and data processing. Digital dependence begins to resemble older forms of energy dependence with similar vulnerabilities. This is how a technical issue becomes systemic. Artificial intelligence is often framed as a race, but races are won not only by speed, but by endurance. Energy systems determine endurance. Countries that align artificial intelligence growth with stable and affordable electricity gain long-term advantage. Those that cannot face higher costs, slower adoption, or deeper social friction. The international comparison reveals a difficult truth. There is no universal solution. Each system absorbs the shock differently, but none escape it. Choices made now will shape competitiveness, inequality, and stability for decades. And that leads to the final stage of the story. If every path forward carries cost, how can societies choose deliberately rather than drift into outcomes they never openly debated? There is no cost-free solution to the electricity shock created by artificial intelligence data centers. Every realistic path forward involves trade-offs, political resistance, and difficult choices. The question is not whether societies will pay, but how openly and how fairly those costs will be distributed. The first path is to build faster. Governments can accelerate grid expansion by simplifying, permitting, prioritizing transmission investment, and funding critical infrastructure. This response is intuitive and frequently announced. It is also slow to deliver results. Major grid projects require years, not months. They depend on land access, skilled labor, and large equipment, such as transformers that already face global shortages. Even when political will exists, physical timelines do not compress easily. Building faster also raises a distributional challenge. Grid expansion is capital-intensive. When financed through regulated utilities, costs flow into electricity tariffs. When financed publicly, they flow into taxes or government debt. In both cases, households and small businesses pay long before they experience any productivity gains from artificial intelligence. The second path is to price demand more honestly. Large, inflexible electricity loads impose disproportionate stress on power systems. One response is to require those loads to bear a greater share of the infrastructure cost they trigger. Higher connection charges, system impact fees, or peak-based pricing can align incentives and encourage efficiency. In practice, this approach is politically sensitive. Governments fear deterring investment. Technology firms warn of relocation. Jurisdictions compete with one another rather than coordinate. The result is a tendency to offer favorable terms, even when local systems are already under strain. The third path is to manage demand rather than chase it. Demand flexibility has long existed in theory, but has rarely been applied to digital infrastructure. In principle, some artificial intelligence workloads could shift across time or location, reducing peak stress on grids. Facilities could integrate on-site generation, storage, or contractual obligations to curtail demand during emergencies. Elements of this approach are emerging gradually. However, widespread adoption requires regulatory clarity, coordination across markets, and a willingness to rethink expectations of constant availability. These changes challenge established business models and require trust between public authorities and private operators. Beyond these immediate responses lie broader future scenarios. In a managed transition, governments act early. Grid investment accelerates. Large electricity users contribute more transparently to system costs. Demand flexibility becomes standard practice. Electricity systems remain reliable, but costs are openly debated rather than quietly absorbed. In a backlash scenario, costs rise without explanation. Electricity bills increase. Outages attract public attention. Political narratives harden. Climate policy becomes entangled with energy anger. Artificial intelligence expansion slows, not through planning, but through resistance. In a fragmented future, geography determines outcomes. Artificial intelligence clusters in regions with abundant energy and flexible regulation. Other areas fall behind. Dependence on external computing capacity deepens. Inequality between regions widens, driven by infrastructure rather than innovation. None of these futures is inevitable, but inaction favors the worst combinations. When systems evolve faster than institutions, decisions are made by default rather than design. This chapter leaves a final question hanging. If artificial intelligence is to become foundational infrastructure, who is responsible for ensuring that its physical costs are understood, shared, and justified? That question brings the story to its conclusion. The rise of artificial intelligence data centers reveals more than an energy challenge. It exposes how modern economies make choices when innovation accelerates faster than infrastructure, and when private decisions quietly reshape public systems. Artificial intelligence is often described as weightless. It lives in software, models, and the cloud. Electricity is not. It has physical limits. It flows through grids that must be built, maintained, and paid for. As artificial intelligence scales, those limits do not disappear. They are transferred into electricity bills, public investment, and political compromise. This story is not an argument against artificial intelligence. It is an argument for transparency. If artificial intelligence is truly essential to future productivity, security, and prosperity, then its physical costs should be visible and openly debated, not hidden inside network charges, not absorbed silently by those with the least bargaining power. Progress that depends on obscurity is not progress. It is redistribution without consent. History shows that systems do not fail when change is fast. They fail when responsibility is unclear. Incentives shape outcomes. When costs are invisible, they multiply. When they are acknowledged, they can be managed. The electricity shock created by artificial intelligence is not a distant threat. It is already present in grids, tariffs, and policy trade-offs. The remaining question is whether societies confront it deliberately or continue assuming that intelligence can grow without limits, while physical systems quietly bear the strain. If this analysis helped clarify how power actually works, consider subscribing, sharing, and joining the discussion. Understanding the structure of the system is the first step toward changing who it ultimately serves.